I've got the young American cellist John Henry Crawford on the phone with me. First of all, let me welcome you to the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, now you have accomplished quite a bit for your career thus far. You were Young Artist of the Year, named by Classical Recording Foundation, and you also won the Prieto Cello Competition in Mexico, which is a big, important competition for young cellists. So now you have your debut album. It's called DIALOGO, which comes from one of the tracks that's on the disc, but in the larger sense, it means dialogue. And in your notes, you talk about how dialogue is a theme that runs throughout these three different works you've got on here. Why don't we start with that idea of dialogue? Tell us a little bit about the recording itself and what ties together the music of Johannes Brahms and Dmitri Shostakovich and György Ligeti on this recording.
Absolutely. Well, making this recording was really, really special for me because I got to work with a longtime friend and collaborator, Victor Santiago Asuncion, the pianist on the album. And we worked with Adam Abeshouse and recorded it, in about 3 or 4 days. And, this theme of dialogue, it's applicable to, I think, many different works of music. And the concept of dialogue is kind of ever present in any time you have works of chamber music with multiple players. But with these pieces in particular, I felt that there was a more present aspect and a more obvious aspect of dialogue. And that's what kind of intrigued me to want to explore this idea. The Ligeti, what's fascinating about this piece is it is a solo cello work, yet intertwined inside of this, solo work, you have multiple characters who are talking with each other on a solo instrument. And so there's kind of this irony where you have, one cello, yet multiple voices within this piece talking to one another. And so in that sense, I think the Ligeti is one of the more sort of unique aspects where you can find the dialogue.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Ligeti while you have it in your mind right now. This is a piece that's in 2 movements. It's fairly short. They're like 4 minutes or so a piece. And when Ligeti wrote this piece back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, it wasn't really performed or brought to light for quite a while, although now it's really well known. Is that right?
Yes, it's played, the world over by cellists, and it's one of those pieces that it didn't really have like you said, didn't really have a big reputation, and then I'd say in the late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, it really started to get to build to where nowadays, it's synonymous with the Kodai sonata. If you're going to learn a solo cello piece, well, there's Ligeti, there's Kodai, which is a very famous solo sonata. And the sort of story behind the piece is an interesting one because it's this classic idea of unrequited love, where Ligeti, he fell for a fellow student, Anus Virani, who was a cellist. And, he was in love with her, and he decided he was going to write this piece for her. And at the time, it was just the first movement of the cello sonata. And so within this movement, you have this sort of love duet where these multiple voices are speaking with one another, responding, pleading, and then singing together. And after all this, the student kind of said, okay, yeah, maybe I'll take a look at that. And didn't really perform it or anything, didn't really give Ligeti maybe the time of day. And so the story goes, many years later, he revisited the piece and decided, after he was, more famous, that he would write a second movement. And the second movement is very much kind of possibly a retort to that. So it's an interesting contrast to the first movement.
Well, it should be said that it's not an easy piece, and I guess that explains why it's played so often by, cellists getting into conservatory or that sort of thing, or playing for an orchestra. It's one of those audition-type pieces. It really puts you through your paces being for the solo cellos, so there's a lot of expressivity and probably a lot of room for your own interpretation. Was this a piece that you learned specifically for this disc, or had you already worked on it before?
It's actually a piece that I've studied on and off for probably over a decade.
Yeah.
And it's one of those that really stuck with me. I think, as a cellist, we're always looking to broaden our repertoire, and especially the solo repertoire. And, we're very fortunate to have the Bach suites and pieces like the Kodály Sonata, the Casado suite for solo cello. And this is one of those that, as you mentioned, it's more concise. The movements are about 4 minutes each, and it's something that you can sort of bring out, whenever needed, and if you want a sort of short, but very impactful work that you can play in under 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And as you said, again, with all the gymnastics on the cello in the second movement, it's one of those that certainly puts you through your paces and is a good litmus test for auditions and so forth.
Tell our listeners a little bit about you. You are originally from Shreveport, is that right?
That's right. I was born and raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, and started cello in my mother's Suzuki program at age 5. She runs the largest Suzuki program in Louisiana. It's got about 150 students. And I was one of 4 boys, and we alternated. The oldest played violin, and then cello, and then violin, and then I ended up with cello.
Yeah, so obviously a musical family, which leads me to the story of your cello. I'm reading here that it was smuggled out of Austria by your grandfather. Can you tell us the story behind that?
Yes. So my grandfather, when he was about 29, close to the age that I am now, I'm just a year younger than he was at the time, he sort of saw the writing on the wall and decided that it was time to leave his home country. He was from Austria and lived in Innsbruck. And this was about 7 weeks before Kristallnacht. And he saw the climate changing, the social and political climate changing so much that he didn't feel like he had a future there anymore. He felt that he needed to get out of Austria and out of Europe. And so he made the difficult but life-changing decision to leave Europe completely, leave his parents. He tried to convince them to come, but, they didn't see this as much, and ultimately, he bought a Nazi travel passport on the black market so that he could take a train through Germany. And he ended up in Lithuania, and then he went to Latvia, and he awaited a sponsor to certify his immigration to the U.S. It's a much longer story than I have time to tell here now, but he was the only passenger on a cargo ship to get to England, and then he had to go back to recover instruments that he had smuggled out to Switzerland from Austria. And so this cello that I play on is one of those instruments. He knew an American boy who made regular trips to Switzerland, and he had them bike them out of Austria because the Austrian exit tax was whatever you owned. Anything that was on your person, you couldn't leave with. So this cello has been through quite a lot, and I wish it could, talk, because I'm sure it would have plenty to say and on its experiences and its journeys. Yeah. But it's a beautiful instrument, and we don't know what it is. There's no label. We know the wood is from the Alps, and we know that it was opened in Czechoslovakia at one point. It was purchased in Vienna, and it made its way all around Europe. So it's really a mystery, but it really sings, and I have a special connection with it.
Well, it's just an incredible story, and it certainly colors one's perception of the music when they hear you playing this particular cello. I want to mention also, you have a pretty prominent social media presence on Instagram, and I've read this in your bio, and I took a look at your Instagram page. Now, I saw the video you did of the Happy Birthday medley, and that was for your grandmother, right? For her 100th birthday.
That was my grandmother, Mariana Popper, who was, my grandfather's wife. His name was Robert Popper. She just turned 100 a couple weeks ago, and we're just so fortunate and blessed to have her with us still, and she's just a really wonderful light for our family, and it was really special to make that for her and send it to her. And unfortunately, I couldn't be with her in person this year because of all of the travel restrictions and logistics. But it was really special to do that. And whenever I'm home for her, I always play for her, and I'll just practice for her for a couple hours, and she loves it. And she always checks in on me and asks if I'm still practicing every day. And so. No, thank you for asking. It was a really special time.
I like how you did it in sort of a sonata form, with the middle movement being a little Beethoven mixed in with the Happy Birthday.
Yes, a little Moonlight Sonata.
Yeah, that's lovely. Some of your other videos on there, it's interesting to look at social media presence of different performers and the way that they present themselves as performers. And you're doing this thing called the 1,000 Day Journey, which is kind of a take on what other performers have done, showing their practicing and learning music and what have you. But you've got some interesting camera angles. Like, you have the camera set, like we're watching you from the bottom of the strings, looking up. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, do you just sort of make that up as you go along, or do you plan them out? How do you approach making these little videos?
I would say it's a combination of both. I like to... The reason that I wanted to explore that is because I really like cinematography, and I love, films that have really beautiful cinematography. And I thought, what if I, tried this on cello, and what if I captured it in a way that you don't really see every day? And so that's why, I tried the bottom of the strings, and sometimes I'll go from above. But I would say every day, depending on the music I'm playing, I'll think, this would look really interesting if I just came at it right from above the fingerboard, or if I show them the left hand movement in this particular passage, or sometimes I'll put the camera right next to the bow, to where you can really see the bow movement. So I thought, as a non-musician, what would I want to see, and what kind of technical or visual aspects would be interesting to see from different vantage points. Yeah. So it's been fun to play around with, but every day, as you said, it's a little different, and I like to sort of decide on the spur of a moment what would be good.
Yeah. Well, you've got over 55,000 followers on your Instagram page. We'll link to that. It's at Cello Crawford. Lots of interesting stuff there. Let's get back to the album and talk about these other two pieces. When you look at it, you see three composers who, on the surface, would seem to be very different. Jerzy Ligeti and Dmitri Shostakovich and Johannes Brahms. You've tied them together with this idea of the dialogue, and we talked about Ligeti and his sort of unrequited love that runs through his solo sonata. On the flip side, you've got Shostakovich, who also wrote his cello work during a difficult time in his life. Can you tell us a little about that?
Absolutely. So it's similar to the Ligeti in the sense that it was born out of this idea of falling in love with a young student. And in this case, it was a young translator. But at the time, Shostakovich was already married. Yeah. And so upon hearing about this, Shostakovich and his wife divorced for a time when she became aware of this. And as you could imagine, this sonata being written during that period of separation, it's it's very desolate at times. And the third movement in particular is this kind of soliloquy, and this concept of dialogue comes back in a sense, in a sort of non-traditional sense, that Shostakovich is speaking to himself almost. He's communicating with different phrases, and he's responding to himself. Why did I do this? Or, here's what I'm feeling. And so, the cello line is kind of the protagonist in this sense, and reflects Shostakovich's frame of mind, kind of frustration, searching, isolation. And so I think that's one element of dialogue that maybe is less obvious, that is interesting to point out, that we can have dialogue with ourselves. And, the whole theme of dialogue, I sort of came up with this idea, piecing it together with, this past year with the pandemic. There was so much isolation and so much, separation from other people that highlighting this concept of dialogue, I think, is really important, so that we, make sure to communicate with one another, keep dialogue happening. And dialogue was really the thing that I think kept us going in a sense. And the ability to talk with people over the phone and over the internet. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have some of these technologies.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I've spoken with countless musicians over the past year, and they've told me how it's affected them. But you are a young musician. You're pretty much toward the beginning of your career. How has this presented challenges to you to keep developing, as it were?
Well, I'd say for each individual, musician, it's probably posed different challenges, but the one that is probably universal is the fact that, the summer before the pandemic began, I had been fortunate to win the Prieto competition and also the Classical Recording Foundation prize. And, as a result of those awards, I was fortunate to be given some performance opportunities and another recording opportunity in addition to this one, which were all scheduled for springtime. And unfortunately, they were all postponed and halted because of the pandemic, and have yet to still be rescheduled. A lot of this performance were going to be in Mexico. And so, I would say hitting pause is one of the more challenging aspects of this. Yeah. Right as you're trying to get your career going, right as some things are kind of helping give you a boost, having to hit pause and, essentially just wait and be patient for when the time comes to ramp things back up. That was really difficult for me. And I think for a lot of musicians, because, you want to get things going. You want to be building and moving in the right direction. But it taught me a lot of patience, and it taught me that, you can't control the world. You can't control everything, and you have to sort of make your best of every situation. So it was definitely a challenge, and, continues to be something that we have to work through.
Well, hopefully this new album will help introduce you to folks who are not familiar with your work, and to our listeners as well. Before I let you go, I want to mention the Brahms Sonata, because that is probably the most, squarely in the repertoire of all the pieces that you have on this album. And it really gives your pianist, Victor Asuncion, a chance to shine in relation to the cello. And this is a dialogue also, yeah?
Absolutely. It's a dialogue, I think, in the more traditional sense, with classical form and nature, and so especially with the rhythmic motives, you have these in the very beginning of the Brahms, you have these soaring, singing lines where the cello is sort of reacting to the piano rolls, the piano chords, and then it develops into a different kind of dialogue, into sort of a rhythmic motive, where there's bum bum bum, and the piano responding bum bum bum, and the pianist and cellist are you can really hear this kind of idea of speech, of speaking to one another, of words and syllables. And so it's a very kind of microscopic view of dialogue. And this develops in each movement. There's kind of a different variation on that. So in the second movement, it returns to this longer speech-like, this longer vocal line. And then you have the pizzicato come back with these more speech-like motives.
Well, it's a lovely performance, and all three works on here are so well performed. I want to mention the album DIALOGO comes out June 4th. It's from Orchid Classics. Cellist John Henry Crawford with pianist Victor Asuncion. And John Henry, I want to thank you for spending some time introducing yourself, bringing this music to our listeners here on FM 91.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Brad. I really appreciate it, and great talking with you.